Today on the Life Science Success Podcast, I have Dusty Majumdar. He's a senior executive leader in healthcare and life sciences for the last couple of decades and has been leading in positions in companies like GE Healthcare, IBM Watson Health, Exact Sciences, and a range of startups. Welcome to the show, Dusty.
Thank you.
Yeah, so can you tell the audience just a little bit about yourself and what you've been working on?
Yeah, sure, Don. As you mentioned, I've been in the healthcare and life sciences space for almost a couple of decades now. This includes diagnostic imaging, AI of late, liquid biopsies, somewhere in the middle to detect cancer early, and more recently getting involved more and more in real-world data and real-world evidence, leveraging clinical genomic data across organizations like Cancer Link with ASCO and a number of startups in the Boston, Cambridge, and New York City area. While working with IBM and later, I think I took around 20 AI-based products across oncology, genomics, population health to the market. And more recently, I've been working on some interesting concepts with organ on chips and organoids on chips, focused on accelerating drug discovery and development through a microenvironment on a plastic chip that actually simulates the natural physiology and mechanical forces that cells experience within the human body. And AI is an integral part of gleaning insights from such systems as well.
Yeah, so, for sure, one of the biggest areas that all of us, I think, can see overall in the space is artificial intelligence. So, could you, just share a little bit more in terms of your perspective, in terms of, what sort of impact do you think that AI is going to have in life sciences?
Yeah, so I've been fortunate to see the cycle of AI through the past decade fairly closely. First with IBM, and then, as I said, with other tech companies and startups. And I think after some initial hiccups that we saw, we are slowly starting to reap the benefits of AI. So I really believe that we are living in an era of tremendous convergence in health of various forces coming together, which are going to define the next era of healthcare and life sciences. So first, we have more data coming in at us than ever before. Clinical data, genomic data. Genomic data today far exceeds even astronomical data that we are collecting. So it's really superseding everything else, including social media data. So this is getting to a point where we can actually glean insights from this data that was not possible before. Secondly, we have computing power that's available to us more than any other point in history. And third, we have AI coming to a degree of maturity finally with natural language processing and machine learning and deep learning that we can actually think of having clinical applications which deliver on better patient outcomes and going beyond the last decade. So, one of the pet peeves I have is really about this term artificial intelligence. I think it's just an old term. I don't like it because it almost sounds like machines are taking over. And I prefer the term augmented intelligence, which sounds more like augmenting human intelligence or brain power. And when you think of AI, to me, AI is simply the ability of machines to simulate some narrow forms of human intelligence, at least at this time. There'll be a time when it's going to be a little bit more generalized. But today is not when we can claim that. And one approach to developing this intelligence is what is called machine learning, which is a subset of AI where computers learn inductively without being explicitly programmed. Machine learning, at its most basic, is the practice of using algorithms to parse data, learn from it, and then make a determination or prediction about something in the world. So further along the spectrum, you have deep learning, right? And now you're using neural networks, leveraging learning algorithms that mimic the function of the human brain. And there's some controversy around that, whether it really does that or not. But there is no doubt today that AI systems can outperform human experts and at least aid them significantly in reducing their workload. At the same time, we face an inconvenient truth today, which is the pace at which AI techniques are emerging is out of balance with the adoption rate in practice. In fact, we discussed this sometime back. Joe Kevadar from the Harvard Medical School made a statement in an article of Nature, I think it was in 2017, that nearly 100% of US healthcare will be delivered with 0% AI involvement. Now, that situation is changing. AI can easily equal or outperform humans at simple, repetitive tasks. And physicians, as you know, by and large, don't enjoy repetitive rote tasks like entering data into the EMR system. They enjoy the application of reason and judgment to complex problems to help patients, right? So I think this is where the first applications of AI are really beginning to show promise.
Yeah, so maybe can we just back up just slightly, and can you help me a little bit with your definition of AI? Because as I think about it, right? I mean, it's easy for me to sit here and say, well, for any home that happens to have the thing that Amazon sells and has those little boxes that talk everywhere, and I'm purposely not saying it to not trigger it for anybody that's on, but that seems amazing, but at the same time, it's pretty basic in terms of what it does. It listens for a cue, and then it kind of responds based on, your sort of series of words, which isn't really that complex. But what I hear you talking about is kind of that next generation of something that's actually thinking behind the scenes.
Well, I think we are getting there. The first applications that you see in AI are rather simple. They're really targeted towards clinician burnout, which is a huge issue today, and AI has the potential to reduce it. So which is not, a lot of these applications are not much more sophisticated than the one that you mentioned. And at this stage, the focus of AI in this early stage in healthcare and life sciences could be to eliminate keyboards for clinicians, where they spend more time with patients during a patient encounter, use machines to detect errors, harness data to improve outcomes. If it helps them in the diagnosis, that's great. But there'll always, at this point at least, there'll be a physician that's really in charge, and try to give clinicians and patients back the gift of time. Now, things are changing as we speak, right? So we are slowly going to the next level of sophistication with AI, but AI is nowhere yet near that magic bullet that was once touted. AI has made rapid strides in radiology or medical imaging, so understanding patterns in cancer pathology, various eye-related diseases. So we're getting there. One of the astounding features or statistics actually in medical imaging is that 30% of scans today in CT, MRI, and X-ray that radiologists read have false negatives. So they're missing features, right? So with the help of AI, it has been shown in various clinical studies that you can dramatically reduce the extent of these false negatives. Or in other words, you're going to, capture the lesions or the features of clinical importance that radiologists might miss if you have an augmented device. So we're kind of getting to the next level where AI is augmenting the performance of radiologists. We see the same thing in colonoscopy. I spent some years looking at colorectal cancer, and in colonoscopy, you often miss smaller polyps. And AI has shown in randomized clinical trials the ability to augment this human capacity of the GI docs and not miss those small polyps, which could be ticking time bombs if you're not watching them carefully. Early in my involvement, I was fortunate to work with a company in San Francisco called Arteris, who are using deep learning for cardiac MRI post-processing, for quantifying 4D flow and ventricular function volumes. With AI tools, they were able to do a better job not only of a faster exam of the patient was there in the scanner for less amount of time, so it was great for the patient, but also reduced the post-processing time by 25 minutes. And the results were as accurate as, I think, 7 experts they assembled to do it side by side. So these are some of the applications where we're seeing a little bit more sophisticated use cases of AI. Of late, and this is kind of where I think it's going, I've been focusing more on the world of biopharma, and the potential of AI in this space is almost boundless. Pharma is under increasing pressure. It takes $2 billion to get a drug to the market, 8 to 12 years.
And going up by the year, right? By the way, so
yeah. And 5% probability that any molecule would start with is going to ultimately make it to the market. So AI has the potential, and we can talk about this later. And this is where it gets to some more sophisticated applications of AI, like explainable AI and causal AI, where you can actually fast track the discovery process, enable protocol development, speed up the entire clinical trial process, and generate evidence, and at the same time reduce the costs. So I think this in silico trials, leveraging AI and kind of forming digital twins of individual patients and patient populations would be the next level of applications that we are all waiting for.
Yeah, and I think I keep hearing more and more, I think, in the space as well, that people are trying to go down this pathway. It seems like there's just an awful lot of hype as well, I feel like, around AI as well. And so, can you talk to us a little bit about the things that need to change, kind of, for greater acceptance, I guess, of AI in healthcare and biopharma?
Right. I mean, look, Don, there's always hype associated with the introduction of any new technology. I remember when functional MRI was introduced, I think it was in the early 90s, there was tremendous hype, back then. I mean, being from GE, I think we probably remember some of that, some of those anecdotal stories that we may have heard. So, there is always hype at the beginning, but typically it sorts itself out and we see some real benefits coming. But, I do agree that some of the hype that we saw with AI in healthcare was off the charts. Never seen anything like that in my career, at least. And was driven by tech companies like IBM, Microsoft in its earlier manifestations, and frankly, Google, when they started touting their amazing results in predicting acute kidney, being able to predict acute kidney failure and detecting diabetic retinopathy before they did the clinical validation. So that was sort of bizarre claims coming from some of the tech industries. But I think with time, we see that dying out. And we also see, and this is the good news, traditional healthcare technology-oriented companies, which were slow to adopt AI initially, like Siemens and GE, now coming up with narrow but solid applications in AI, which are actually integrated with the clinical workflow and delivering value in reducing busy work and augmenting clinicians' capacity to diagnose disease, and getting the trust that is highly needed in AI because of all the hype that initially created some of the distrust around AI. Recently you may have seen this Robert Siegel, who's pretty close to some of our leadership at GE when we were there, of Stanford University, just wrote a book came out called Brains and Brawn. And, I really agree with him that companies in the future, which will make the biggest impact in healthcare, will be the ones that understand the physical and the digital world and can go across them seamlessly. So it's not an either or decision. And the future winners, what I see is will really embrace the powers of brain and brawn. And I think legacy companies, like the ones I mentioned, will change their technology and culture, and startups that often lack scale and logistics, will learn, and, it's all going to come together. And a lot of the stumbles that we saw of AI in healthcare are companies which resided solely in the digital world and had little understanding the physical, which is the patient experience, the clinician burnout, the real clinical unmet needs, which led to a lot of craziness and disappointments we saw in the market between 2012 to 2018 or so. So I think that's changing.
Yeah, it's great to hear, and I normally sort of account that, healthcare and somewhat pharma in general, right, are slower to adopt certain things, than other areas of the business. I mean, do you have any sort of perception in terms of the limitations and on the adoption of AI?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the adoption and the utility of AI, it all ultimately comes down to the quality and the quantity of data, that good data that you can harness and train your systems on. Dr. Atul Butte at UCSF calls it the 5 V's of data, right? Volume, variety, velocity, value, and veracity of data. And you could read about it in his publications. A lot of the efforts in early on with AI failed because there was just not enough data, not enough variety or diversity of data from different kinds of patients, and the data simply didn't have much value. It was garbage in, garbage out. Mm-hmm. And I think unless you have the 5 V's of data, you'll have issues with trustworthiness of the algorithms, the bias in the AI algorithms, which ultimately will lead to lack of adoption. I think the other obstacle in the widespread adoption of AI is still the perception of AI as a black box. So the current AI solutions, even the ones approved by FDA, creates somewhat of an uncomfortable situation for physicians and patients because we can't tell which features the machines use to generate the predictions. And without a thorough understanding of how AI is working, it's kind of difficult to assuage the fear of these, runaway machines that have been stoked by movies like The Matrix or The Terminator or the 2001 Odyssey. And in a nutshell, we don't know what these algorithms are doing and how they're doing it. Since we aren't in a position to understand them, they can be trusted and shouldn't be relied upon. Now, one could not argue here that, look, I mean, if you have a highly accurate algorithm that's predicting very robustly, whether it's in clinical decision support or making a diagnosis, and FDA has cleared it, is that really a problem if it's a black box, right? So I think that's the argument a lot of the companies have been using, and in some cases, in clinical decision support and image processing, that may be okay at this initial stage. At least AI is reducing the drudgery of doing some of this busy work by augmenting the clinician. And of course, the clinician has to be ultimately in charge. But in drug discovery and some of the areas in biopharma where we are trying to understand the complex interactions between genomic data, lab data, clinical data from the patient, and in some cases, we're trying to develop this virtual or in silico arm of a clinical trial, like having a digital twin for the patients or the patient populations. I mean, understanding the underlying circuitry of disease becomes so important that traditional deep learning algorithms don't allow us to establish the causal relationships across this complex network of disease. And certainly a black box is not the way to go about trying to do drug discovery.
Yeah, and it definitely, if it could speed the pathway from one sort of understanding which things will make it to the finish line and which ones won't, that certainly would help, even just a lot of companies sort of sort through what they should be pursuing versus what they shouldn't. And then the second part is, the timeline to actually develop a drug is such a long, process. So anything that could actually help and be trusted there seems like a great direction to go for any pharma company.
Well, I agree, and I think this whole thing around explainable AI is going to become more and more important in certain areas of drug discovery and drug development. And It all started actually 20 years ago with Julia Pearl, who actually published a series of papers and a book called Causality, and more recently a book called The Book of Why. And what Julia Pearl called for in AI algorithms is greater transparency. And one of his proclamations was that AI needs a ladder to reach the fruits of higher benefits. And he called it the ladder of causality. So this idea has been picked up by pioneers like Eric Schadt, the CEO at Semaphore, Colin Hill, the CEO at GNS, who for the last couple of decades really have been obsessed with this idea of causal AI, and they understand how little just understanding simple genomics leads to true unraveling of the circuitries of human disease, particularly in the case of cancer, late stage cancer, and complex neurodiseases. And I mean, as you know, as cancer advances, there is increasing diversity of the cancer tumor microenvironment and heterogeneity of genomic mutations, and a lot of polyclonality set in. So if you're trying to unravel new drug targets or identify new prognostic markers or predict patient response at the individual level, it is critical that you understand the causal relationships between the genomic data, the proteomic data, the clinical data, the gene expression, the patient demographic data. In other words, to get to the underlying mechanical circuitry of disease, you need to bring it all together. And this is where black box deep learning algorithms are not going to be very helpful. You need to kind of move towards causal AI kind of algorithm where you get to the bottom of cause and effect, relationships in individuals and populations, and also go beyond that. You could simulate a number of what-if scenarios from the network once you establish that, and establish the causal relationships that you can actually study systematically the outcomes of perturbing this network. And I think that's where AI is going. And that's kind of, you referred to this before, kind of the next phase of AI that I see in certain segments where it is needed.
Yeah. And do you, in terms of the fight against COVID, how would you say that AI, helped in our fight against COVID?
It was interesting because you don't see a lot of noise from all the buzz in the last 7-8 years that we had around AI. There has not been as much noise around AI being the savior for COVID. We haven't seen that. But I personally feel that AI served its purpose in a few ways. In medical imaging, for example, it helped in interpreting the images rapidly, diagnosing, detecting, and stratifying COVID-19 patients quickly, especially outside the United States, where, in China, for example, and in Italy, where you have the first major outbreaks, and CT and the combination of some simpler forms of machine learning were used to quickly predict which patients would have worse outcomes, looking at the features in the initial stages of the disease from a CT scan, for example. So I think that was helpful. Not a whole lot of that was done in the United States, because by the time COVID came to the United States, we had, to a great degree, developed the PCR tests and the rapid tests, and we kind of depended on that. And overuse of imaging is something which is obviously an anathema in the United States, and so it was used a lot outside. And AI was actually incorporated in some of the countries like China and Italy. Now, I think it's getting much more interesting than that now, as we are seeing new variants of the coronavirus evolve, springing up like wildfires across the planet. I was just reading today that there's some new variant called Delta Plus in San Francisco. Yeah. So researchers have been frantically trying to leverage AI to determine which strains might outwit our brand new vaccines that are out there, right? And there's a paper published in June in science, I believe, with where researchers from MIT described a machine learning algorithm that can predict which mutations would pose the biggest threat to the world's fledgling immunity. So this tool could be used to quickly narrow down the mutations which are likely to evade the immune systems of people who have been vaccinated or previously infected. So, and again, if you think about all the complexities in doing this, AI could be a very powerful tool to resolve some of this and help us in fighting this pandemic, which we all thought that we kind of moved on from.
Yeah. And I mean, whenever I think about the overall fact that we had a vaccine so quickly, right, it was because of, all the previous research that had been done in SARS and MERS and Ebola. And I mean, they knew more or less sort of what, spike protein, kind of viruses would be like. And, these massive amounts of data are wonderful to have. And a lot of these larger pharma companies, for whatever reason, have been in Africa and other places where these things have been prevalent, and so they've got these massive data sets. And certainly, if there are things that could think through, sort of, okay, where is this thing going to go next, and what other things have we seen that look like the thing that's coming, right? So it would certainly help us, it seems.
Absolutely, and I think that's where I feel is going to really prove its worth, tackling this the coronavirus and the mutations that are going to evolve from now onwards, and making sure that we are ready for the next and the next and the next, and help us grow that global immunity against the disease.
Yeah. So I mean, the next sort of thought that I have, and you and I were having a conversation in general about physicians. My parents essentially live in an area that's in rural Indiana, and so they don't have access to the same sort of technologies or the same sort of doctors that I have near a big city. And so do you think that AI will ever become smart enough to replace or even augment clinicians anytime in the near future?
Replace? I don't think so in the near future, or maybe even in the distant future. I can't see a time when AI is going to take over medical decisions. It's like a self-driving car, right?
Right.
For a self-driving car to truly become self-driving, it might never happen, right? There's always going to be a human element that's going to control it, at least in the near future. So I do see AI augmenting the clinician. We discussed, how it could do so in radiology or colonoscopy, and really where I think AI would play a role in a rural area would be, in the world of telemedicine, perhaps, kind of taking a scan or, taking an image of the eye, the ophthalmic image, and analyzing it before an expert in Cleveland Clinic can actually take a look at it. So I think that's where I see these applications in the near term going. I also feel AI is going to be good at, and we discussed this, taking away the drudgery of busy work from clinicians and help clinicians spend time doing higher value work. And I do think AI will become seamlessly integrated into the workflow across various modalities to augment clinician capabilities. And this is already happening to a great degree in radiology. Curtis Langlotz, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, at Stanford, when asked a question a few years back, will AI replace radiologists? Because that's kind of the obvious target, right? They replied that, hey, that's a wrong question to ask. The right answer is radiologists who use AI will actually replace radiologists who don't.
Oh, there you go.
Going.
Great. That's a great quote. Yeah. Wonderful. So, Dusty, I've always known you as an astute marketer, right? And when I think about sort of all the hype around AI and things like that, and kind of the absolute astronomical expectations of where AI can go. How much do you think marketing contributed to sort of the vision that people have and things like that with AI?
Oh, well, I think totally. I think tech companies contributed to the hype. And, many of these companies, whether it's IBM Watson or Google or, some crazy startup somewhere, had very little experience in healthcare. And by the time they tried to acquire the critical knowledge needed in healthcare to really understand the issues, their corporate marketing and advertising departments where they had these massive budgets to create this buzz were off to the races, creating a lot of inaccurate and unnecessary buzz across media channels. You may recall that right after IBM Watson won the Jeopardy, they lunged into cancer and made some bizarre claims on TV ads, which clearly proved to be an unwise move. And I think they realize that at the moment. So AI is no substitute for the science that is needed to understand the underlying molecular circuitry of highly complex diseases like late stage cancer. And you got to get the science right before you can actually leverage AI in any sensible way. In my work over the last few years, working with several AI-based companies, big tech, startups, small tech, I've tried to develop what is called this methodology of the RT of AI marketing. So ARTE. So I call it the RT of AI marketing. A stands for authenticity. So you got to make the solutions real, make it tangible. And a big part of this authenticity involves defining AI in a focused way that clearly explains how AI is specifically helping in the task and what the benefit is. R stands for relevance. So begin with the challenge, not just coming up with some whiz-bang algorithm and claiming that you've created the best AI solution in the world. So understand the pressing problem, whether it's in biopharma or healthcare, and describe how your AI solution will help. And T stands for transparency. We talked a little bit about this situation around black box. Unless you can develop trust in the AI solution, it's not going to be adopted widely by clinicians, and it's going to be ridiculed, as has been done for certain solutions which have been out there without doing the groundwork to take them to the market and develop the trust among the KOLs and the adopters that come right after the innovators. And it's been a disaster out there. And E stands for empathy. So too many organizations are developing AI solutions and focusing on the product development part of it. And the user almost becomes an afterthought. So having the empathy for the user, whether it's a healthcare professional or the patient, and designing the AI solution around their world, the world of the clinician or the radiology administrator or the patient, that is going to be the key. So that's kind of my 2 cents on how to really position AI solution, using the RT of marketing. And all 4 of these are critical if you want solutions to emotionally resonate and be adopted by systems, whether it's in pharma or whether it's in healthcare. The other thing that I would also mention that marketing has been guilty of is using words like transformation in healthcare or disrupting healthcare or revolutionizing healthcare. And you see this all over the place. If you go into a website of any of these companies that I mentioned, you'd see that. And if you're a clinician or an administrative staff in a hospital system, you're not looking to be disrupted or revolutionized. In fact, this is kind of the emotionally tone-deaf messaging that has turned many of the stakeholders off. I'll just end with a quote from one of my friends, Daryl Travis, the CEO of Brand Trust. And he said it best a couple of years back. I'll just read from, if I can find it. So he said something like this. Healthcare professionals are not striving to transform healthcare. Instead, they share a deep psychological and existential need to eliminate chaos and restore order in the human body and the human delivery system. If an AI implementation creates chaos or fails to restore order, it commits a cardinal sin for healthcare and life sciences professionals. So this whole idea of disrupting and kind of revolutionizing and transforming, this needs to get out of our marketing parlance in healthcare. And I think very few marketers understand that. Is you just go back to the same well and use the same jargon over and over and over again.
Yeah, the same. I mean, what mentally I keep going back to in a way with some of this conversation has primarily been sort of what we saw previously with Theranos, and that they essentially created this concept that they could have this big drastic swing in the marketplace without actually having the sort of technology to back it up, right? And to me, what I see overall in the space is that there is an evolution that's happening, and that evolution, isn't going to be as drastic as of a swing as we would like for it to be. But at the same time, I do look forward to sort of that end of things, especially whenever I think of, sort of long-term healthcare, or even sifting through mounds of data to try and get to an answer faster. Because certainly, we can take our time, but at the same time, maybe something else could think through it quicker, and then we could go back and verify, back to your black box comment, right? Sort of to outcome that area of the black box, and just think through, how do we solve that?
Absolutely.
Very good. And there are 3 questions that I like to ask every guest. What inspires you?
Well, I guess the ability of the human race, the scientists and the researchers, to collaborate and work together for a better world. We saw this with some of the vaccine development with COVID, where scientists came together and came up with vaccines in less than a year, based on work that had been done before for the last 20 years or so. But kind of even a few years back, this would have taken a much longer time. So I think that's the key to success, ultimately, global cooperation and being able to work together and learn from each other and move faster towards some of these breakthroughs.
And what concerns you?
Well, at the moment, I think I'm concerned by something that concerns a lot of other people, which is we are again lunging towards uncertainty with these different variants, and with large sections of the U.S. population resisting vaccination, and then you have other parts of the world where people still don't have access to vaccines, and this disparity of care around the world that you see concerns me a lot, and it's going to be there in the foreseeable future. Nothing is going to really change it that quickly, whether it's COVID or the next pandemic or the next scare that comes along, and this is something that we have to address.
Yeah, for sure. And what excites you?
Well, I'm excited to be alive in this time in history. If the last century was the century of physics, where we had tremendous breakthroughs in physics and the unraveling the mysteries of the atom and quantum mechanics and going to space, this is going to be the century of biology. And the unprecedented convergence of data, computing power, and AI, it's bound to lead to huge breakthroughs over the next few decades. And I think we have just scratched the surface with AI. So it's exciting to watch as we get closer to unraveling the molecular underpinnings of complex diseases like cancer and other neurological diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and really leveraging the power of AI to get to the bottom of some of this.
Yeah, exciting times for sure. I mean, both from a technological standpoint as well as, just watching overall what's coming together, in science in general. It's just an exciting time. So, Dusty Majumdar, thank you so much for being a guest today. I greatly appreciated our conversation, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Don. It was a pleasure.